The Wyoming wind had a voice, and on most nights Martha Holloway understood its language of loneliness. But tonight it screamed a warning. It wasn't the rattling of her cabin's lone window or the howl of a distant wolf that chilled her blood. It was the other sound, a scrape and a fall unnervingly close. Out there, in the blizzard's white fury, was a man. And as she dragged his half-frozen body across her threshold, she saw the dark braided hair and the beadwork on his buckskin. This was no lost prospector. This was a fugitive, and hiding him would be a death sentence. The fury of the snow was a living thing. It clawed at the log walls of the small cabin and screamed down the stone chimney, making the flames in the hearth dance like panicked sprites. Martha Holloway pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the single window, her breath fogging a small circle in the frost. Outside, the world had vanished, erased by a swirling vortex of white. It was the kind of blizzard the old-timers called a white death, the kind that buried landmarks and stole the breath from your lungs. For 3 days, she had been a prisoner in the 15 by 15 foot world her husband Robert had built with his own hands before a collapsed mine shaft had claimed him 2 years prior. Loneliness was her most constant companion. It was a dull ache she had learned to carry like the weight of the water buckets from the creek or the heavy iron skillet she cooked her solitary meals in. The nearby town of Redemption Gulch, a raw collection of muddy streets and false-fronted buildings, offered little comfort. She was an outsider there, the quiet widow, who kept to herself, a woman who preferred the silent company of the Bighorn Mountains to the gossiping hens in the general store. They looked at her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. A woman alone was a thing to be fixed or folded into another family. Martha wanted neither. A sudden violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and the timbers groaned in protest. It was then she heard it. Not the wind, not the fire, but a third sound. A muffled scraping thud against the woodpile stacked along the western wall. She froze her hand, flying to the base of her throat. A bear, perhaps, driven down from the high country by the storm, or a mountain lion. She reached for the heavy iron poker resting by the fire, its weight a meager comfort. She waited, her ears straining against the gale. Minutes stretched into an eternity of roaring wind. Then she heard it again, closer this time, a sound like a body slumping against the door itself. A low, guttural moan was stolen by the wind, but she heard it. Fear warred with a deeper, more stubborn instinct. Robert had always said she had a core of prairie steel in her, a stubborn refusal to let the harshness of the world win. Leaving any creature, man or beast, to perish in this storm felt like a betrayal of that core. Gritting her teeth, she slid the heavy bolt on the door. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it open against the interior wall. Snow and ice crystals blasted into the room, instantly dousing the candles on the small table. Lying in a heap on her doorstep was the source of the sound. A man barely visible under a blanket of fresh snow. He was Native American, his long black hair fanned out against the white tube braids, interwoven with strips of otter fur. He wore buckskin leggings and a heavy buffalo hide tunic clothing, ill-suited for the sub-zero fury of the blizzard. One arm was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark, ugly stain was spreading across his right side, melting the snow beneath him into a crimson slush. His eyes were closed, his face the color of ash. For a heartbeat, all the stories she'd ever heard of savage raids of stolen children, of unprovoked violence, rushed through her mind. The people in Redemption Gulch would call her a fool, or worse. They would say she invited the devil himself into her home, but looking down at the man who seemed more a part of the dying earth than a threat, she saw none of the savagery from the tales. She saw only a human being at the precipice of death, With a grunt of exertion that defied her slender frame, she hooked her arms under his shoulders. He was heavier than he looked, a dead weight of muscle and bone. She dragged him inch by painstaking inch across the threshold and out of the storm's embrace. The effort left her gasping, her lungs burning with cold air. With a final heave, she got him fully inside and shoved the heavy door closed, ramming the bolt home against the howling wind. The cabin fell into a sudden muffled silence, the storm now a dull roar outside the walls. In the flickering firelight, she could see him clearly for the first time. His face was all sharp angles, a strong jaw and high cheekbones, etched with lines of pain. A long, healed scar ran from his left temple down to his chin, a pale track on his weathered skin. He was young, perhaps her own age of 27, but his face held the gravity of a much older man. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. With Robert's hunting knife, she slit the seam of his tunic and leggings, peeling away the frozen, blood-soaked hide. The wound in his side was a ragged tear, ugly and deep, likely from a rifle ball. His arm was worse. A piece of jagged bone protruded from the skin just below the elbow. He stirred as she cleaned the wound, a low groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open for a moment. They were not the wild, hate-filled eyes of the dime novel savages. They were dark, intelligent, and filled with a universe of pain. Then they rolled back, and he was unconscious again. She worked for hours by the light of the fire and a single tallow candle. She poured whiskey into the wound, earning a sharp, involuntary hiss from the man. She stitched the gash closed with her finest needle, and thread the same she used for mending Robert's shirts. Setting the bone in his arm was the worst part. She had to brace her foot against his chest and pull with all her might, the sickening crunch of bone seating itself echoing in the small cabin. He screamed then, a raw, piercing sound that was swallowed by the storm. She splintered the arm with pieces of a broken crate and strips torn from her own petticoat. Finally, she wrapped him in her warmest wool blankets and managed to half-lift, half-drag him onto the rope bed in the corner, her bed. She sat in the rocking chair Robert had made for her, the iron poker across her lap, and watched him breathe. The firelight played across his stoic features. He was a secret, a dangerous secret lying in her bed. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed at her to throw him back into the storm. But as she watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest, another feeling took root in her lonely heart. For the first time in 2 years, she was not alone in the cabin, and she knew with a certainty that both terrified and thrilled her that nothing in her life would ever be the same. The blizzard raged for 2 more days, cocooning the cabin in a world of white silence. Inside time was measured by the man's breathing and the slow drip of melted snow from the eaves. Martha moved like a phantom, tending the fire-melting snow for water, and spooning thin broth between the stranger's cracked lips. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring in a language she didn't understand, the words flowing like a river over smooth stones. During his brief moments of lucidity, his dark eyes would follow her, watchful and unreadable. He never spoke a word of English, and she began to wonder if he knew any. She learned the contours of his face, the way a muscle in his jaw would tighten when a wave of pain washed over him, the surprising softness of the black hair she had to brush from his fevered brow. She was no nurse, but she knew the folk remedies of the mountains. She brewed willow bark tea for his fever and made a poultice of comfrey leaves for the swelling in his arm. Slowly, painstakingly, the fever began to recede. On the 5th day since his arrival, the wind died, and a brilliant, blinding sun rose over the snow-covered peaks. The world was reborn, pristine and silent. The man was awake, and his eyes were clear. He was sitting up, leaning against the wall, the blankets pooled around his waist. He watched her as she ladled stew into a bowl. "You have a name?" she asked softly, her voice feeling loud in the stillness. He stared at her for a long moment, his gaze intense, as if he were taking her measure. Then he spoke, his voice a low, raspy baritone. "They call me Kestrel." The English was perfect without the clipped accent of some of the other natives she had heard in town. The name suited him. He had the sharp, predatory stillness of the bird of prey she often saw circling the high ridges. "I am Martha Holloway," she replied, handing him the bowl of stew. Their fingers brushed, and a jolt like static electricity passed between them. He took the bowl without a word, his eyes never leaving hers. The truce between them was fragile, an unspoken agreement forged in a storm. He needed her to heal. She didn't know what she needed, but the oppressive silence of her life had been broken. He never spoke of his wounds or how he came to be at her door. He was a man wrapped in secrets, and she found herself respecting his silence, not wanting to push and unravel the mystery of him. After a week, the trail to Redemption Gulch was passable. Their supplies were dangerously low, and Martha knew she had to make the trip. Kestrel was still weak, but he could now stand and walk a few steps around the cabin. "I have to go to town," she told him, bundling herself in a heavy wool cloak. "For flour and salt. You'll be safe here. No one ever comes this far up the trail." His expression was grim. "Town is a place of lies. Be careful." The warning hung in the air as she made her way down the mountain. Redemption. Gulch was stirring back to life after the blizzard. Men shoveled snow from rooftops, and the sound of hammers rang from the blacksmith's shop. Her first stop was the general store, run by a pinched-faced gossip named Henrietta Perkins. As Martha gathered her supplies, she felt the familiar weight of eyes on her back. "Surprised to see you, Mrs. Holloway," Henrietta said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We all thought you'd be snowed in for another week at least. A woman all alone up there. It's a wonder you manage." "I manage just fine, Henrietta," Martha said, her tone clipped. It was as she was paying that she saw it, nailed to the wall by the door among notices for lost cattle and land auctions, was a new poster, the ink still stark and black against the cheap paper. "Wanted $500 reward." Beneath the bold letters was a crude but unmistakable drawing of the man in her cabin. The scar on his cheek was a jagged, angry line. The description was chillingly precise. "For the murder of Lieutenant Gideon Price, United States Cavalry. The fugitive, a former Army scout known as Kestrel, is considered armed and extremely dangerous. He is a Lakota warrior of the Oglala Band. Approach with extreme caution. To be brought in dead or alive." Martha's blood ran cold. The sack of flour suddenly felt immensely heavy in her arms. $500. It was a fortune, more money than she had seen in her entire life. It was enough to leave this place to start a new life, somewhere far away from the judgmental eyes and the painful memories. It was enough to buy her freedom. All she had to do was ride to the sheriff's office and tell him who was sleeping in her bed. Her walk out of the store was a blur. The whispers of the townsfolk seemed to follow her, magnified and menacing. Murderer. Savage. Dangerous. She saw Bartholomew Thorne, the wealthiest rancher in the county, dismounting in front of the saloon. He was a large, imposing man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes as cold and grey as a winter sky. Thorne owned most of the valley and had made no secret of his desire to own her little plot of land with its valuable creek and timber. He had made her several offers, each one more insulting than the last, his polite words barely concealing a predatory hunger. He tipped his hat to her, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Mrs. Holloway. "Good to see you weathered the storm. That's a mighty isolated plot you have. A person could get into all sorts of trouble up there, with no one around to help." His words felt like a threat layered with an insinuation she couldn't quite grasp, but that made her skin crawl. She simply nodded and hurried past him, his gaze boring into her back. The ride home was a torment. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind whispered the word murderer. The man in her cabin, the quiet, watchful man whose wounds she had tended, had killed a cavalry officer. A white man. In this part of the country there was no trial for such a crime, only a rope. And for the woman who harbored him, the same rope, or worse. She entered the cabin to find Kestrel, standing by the window, staring out at the trail she had just taken. He turned as she came in, and his eyes immediately found the poster clutched in her hand. He didn't need to read it. He knew what it was. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken questions and terrible possibilities. "You should have left me in the snow," he said, his voice flat. "Is it true?" she whispered, the poster trembling in her hand. "Is it true that Lieutenant Price is dead?" "Yes," Kestrel said, his gaze unwavering. "Is it true that I murdered him?" "No." He walked over to the hearth and stared into the flames. "Price was a man who enjoyed cruelty. He dealt in whiskey, trading it to my people for land rights. He didn't have the authority to grant getting them drunk and having them sign papers they couldn't read. He took things that weren't his to take. Not just land." His jaw tightened, the muscle pulsing. "He tried to take a young woman from our camp. Her brother tried to stop him. Price shot the boy. I was there. I took the gun from him. It went off in the struggle." The other soldiers ran and told their story. The story that is on that paper. Martha looked from the poster to the man. She saw no lie in his eyes, only a deep, weary pain. She thought of Bartholomew Thorne, of his greedy eyes and polite threats. She had seen men like Lieutenant Price before, men who hid their rotten souls behind a uniform or a veil of civility. She walked to the fireplace, crumpled the poster in her fist and tossed it into the flames. The paper blackened, curled and dissolved into ash. "The fire is low," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "We need more wood before nightfall." Kestrel watched the last of the poster burn away. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something other than pain or watchfulness in his eyes. It was a flicker of profound gratitude, a silent acknowledgement of the impossible choice she had just made. By burning that paper, she had burned her last bridge to the world she knew. Her fate was now tied to his. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became a world unto itself, a solitary island in a sea of snow-capped mountains. The secret they shared was a constant, silent presence binding them together in an uneasy alliance. The dynamic between them shifted. Martha was no longer just a caregiver, and Kestrel was no longer just a patient. They were two solitary people, survivors learning to navigate the small space they shared. Kestrel healed with a speed that astonished her. The deep resilience of his body was matched by a quiet strength of will. He began to take on chores, at first simple tasks, like feeding the fire, then more demanding ones, as his arm mended. He moved with an economy of motion, a predator's grace that made even the mundane act of splitting firewood seem like a ritual. He taught her things she never would have learned on her own. He showed her how to read the tracks in the snow, to distinguish the light tread of a fox from the heavier paw of a wolf. He pointed out the subtle signs, a broken twig, a disturbed patch of snow, that told the story of who or what had passed by. He was teaching her his language, the language of the wilderness. In return, she taught him hers. She read to him in the evenings from the single book she owned, a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies, that had belonged to her father. At first, he just listened, his expression unreadable, as she read of kings and queens, betrayal and sorrow. Then he began to ask questions, his insights sharp and surprising. "This King Lear," he said one evening, his eyes fixed on the fire. "He gave away his land for pretty words, and was left with nothing. His people did not tell him he was a fool." "It's a story, Kestrel," she said softly. "A man who leads his people must listen to the truth, not to the songs he wants to hear." He countered. "My father, the chief, he is old. There are men in our council, like Stone Fist, who sing him songs of war and glory. They tell him the white man can be driven back into the sea. My father wants to believe them, so he listens. It is a fool's song. It will lead to the death of our children." It was the most he had ever spoken of his life, a rare glimpse behind the curtain of his stoicism. She learned that he was not just a warrior, but the son of a chief, a man who carried the weight of his people's future on his shoulders. He had become an army scout, not to betray his people, but to understand the enemy, to learn their ways and their language, to find a path to survival that was not paved with blood. Lieutenant Price had shattered that path. Their conversations were often like this, brief but profound exchanges across the gulf of their different worlds. But more often than not, they communicated in silence. They would share a meal, the only sounds, the clinking of a spoon against a bowl and the crackle of the fire. Yet in these silences, a deep understanding grew. Martha found herself noticing the small things, the way he would always position himself, so he could see the door and the window, the ritualistic way he would clean the hunting knife. She had lent him the faint scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to him. One afternoon he was chopping wood outside. His movements were fluid and powerful, the axe rising and falling in a perfect rhythm. He had shed the blanket he often wore as a cloak, and the winter sun glinted off the scars that crisscrossed his back and shoulders. Martha, mending a tear in his tunic, watched him from the doorway. Each scar told a story. She couldn't read a history of pain and survival etched into his skin. Suddenly, he stopped the axe, held motionless in mid-air. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked, listening to something she couldn't hear. "Someone is coming," he said, his voice a low whisper. "2 riders. From the direction of the town." She strained her ears but heard nothing but the gentle sigh of the wind through the pines. "How can you know the mountain speaks to those who listen?" he said simply. He grabbed the axe and melted into the deep woods behind the cabin, disappearing as if he had never been there. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her apron, her hands trembling slightly, and tried to appear calm. A few minutes later, 2 riders emerged from the trees. One was Bartholomew Thorne. The other was his brutish foreman, a man named Hank. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Holloway," Thorne called out, his voice smooth as oil. He swung down from his expensive saddle, his leather boots sinking into the snow. "Just checking on our neighbors after the big snow. Making sure you have everything you need." "I'm quite all right, Mr. Thorne," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. Thorne's eyes scanned the area, lingering on the large pile of freshly split wood. "That's a man's work for a whole week," he observed, a slight smile playing on his lips. "You are a more industrious woman than I imagined." "I do what needs to be done," she replied coolly. His gaze drifted to the cabin, to the single window. "It's a lonely life up here. Dangerous, too. There's talk in town about that wanted poster for the Indian scout. They say he was last seen heading into these mountains. A killer like that on the loose. A woman alone wouldn't stand a chance. He was fishing, baiting her. She could feel his suspicion like a physical pressure. Hank, his foreman, dismounted and began to walk around the cabin, his movements casual, but his eyes sharp, missing nothing. "I keep a rifle, Mr. Thorne. I know how to use it," she said, meeting his gaze directly. Hank returned to Thorne's side and muttered something too low for her to hear. Thorne's smile tightened. "Well, do be careful. If you see anything unusual, you be sure to let Sheriff Miller know. There's a handsome reward after all, enough to buy a nice little house in town where you'd be safe." The veiled offer hung in the air between them. He wasn't just offering her a reward, he was telling her what to do. Sell out the fugitive, and he'd get what he wanted, her land. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. Thorne mounted his horse, his cold eyes lingering on her for a moment longer before he and Hank turned and rode away. Martha didn't exhale until they had disappeared back into the trees. Kestrel emerged from the woods as silently as he had vanished. He carried a young rabbit in one hand, its neck cleanly broken. That man Kestrel set his eyes on the tracks left by Thorne's horses. He has the spirit of a coyote. He circles, waiting for the weak to fall. He wants this land, Martha said, a weariness seeping into her bones. He wants me gone. He suspects, Kestrel stated. It wasn't a question. Yes, they stood there for a long moment, the dead rabbit a stark reminder of the brutality of survival. Thorne's visit had shattered the fragile peace of their sanctuary. The outside world with its greed and its laws was pressing in on them. Kestrel looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "You did not have to lie for me. He's a worse man than anyone on a wanted poster," she said, her voice filled with a conviction that surprised her. That evening, the silence between them was different. It was no longer just the comfortable quiet of two solitary people. It was the charged silence of co-conspirators, of allies bound by a shared danger. As he handed her the plate with the cooked rabbit, his fingers brushed hers, and this time neither of them pulled away. It was a fleeting touch, but it felt like a vow. In the heart of the unforgiving mountains, surrounded by enemies, they had only each other. The winter began its slow retreat, surrendering the valley to the tentative warmth of a reluctant spring. Patches of green appeared on the forest floor, and the creek beside the cabin, once silenced by ice, began to sing again. But as the physical isolation of winter thawed the social isolation that surrounded Martha Holloway, began to freeze solid. Bartholomew Thorne had planted a seed of suspicion, and in the fertile ground of redemption, Gulch's gossip, it had taken root and grown into a thorny vine of accusation. Her trips to town became ordeals. The whispers followed her down the muddy main street, slithering from the doorways of the saloon and the blacksmith shop. Henrietta Perkins at the general store would serve her with a cold, formal politeness, her eyes sharp and judgmental. Other women Martha had known for years, would cross the street to avoid her, gathering in tight knots to watch her pass, their faces a mixture of fear and condemnation. The rumor had twisted and morphed. Martha Holloway, the strange widow on the mountain, was an Indian lover. In a town that viewed the native tribes as a constant savage threat, it was the most damning accusation imaginable. One Sunday, driven by a desperate need to feel a part of a community, any community, she attended the small clapboard church. Reverend Miller, a man whose sermons usually focused on fire and brimstone, seemed to direct his entire sermon at her. He spoke of the serpent in the garden, of the dangers of consorting with heathens, of the moral rot that could fester in a lonely heart. He never said her name, but every eye in the congregation was on her. She felt the weight of their judgment like a physical blow, and she fled before the final hymn, her cheeks burning with shame and anger. She was an outcast. Her crime was not hiding a fugitive. They had no proof of that, but simply of being different, of living alone, of not conforming to their narrow expectations. The suspected presence of Kestrel was merely the excuse they needed to formalize her exile. She returned to the cabin that day with a hard knot of despair in her chest. Kestrel was waiting for her, sitting on the porch step, sharpening the blade of her hunting knife with a whetstone. He looked up as she approached, and his astute eyes immediately registered her distress. "The town is a cold fire," he said, his voice quiet. He didn't need to ask what had happened. He saw it in the slump of her shoulders, in the tightness around her mouth. "They hate me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. They think I'm your—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word. "My woman," he finished for her, his expression unreadable. He set the knife and stone aside. Their minds are small cages. They cannot imagine a man and a woman sharing a roof without also sharing a bed. They see your kindness and call it a sin. She sank onto the step beside him, pulling her shawl tightly around her. "Why do they hate your people so much?" He was silent for a long time, watching a hawk circle high above them. "We are a mirror," he said finally. "We show them what they are not. We live with the land and they fight it. We take only what we need and they take all they can hold. We are free and it frightens them. It is easier to hate a mirror than to look at your own face." His words, spoken with a calm, sad wisdom, comforted her more than any platitude could have. He understood. He had lived his entire life as the object of this blind hatred. He knew its weight, its injustice. In that moment, she felt a bond with him that transcended race, that transcended the danger they were in. They were both outsiders, rejected by a world that refused to understand them. Her isolation drove her deeper into the world of the cabin, a world now defined by Kestrel's presence. He became her teacher, her protector, and in a way she was afraid to admit even to herself, her only friend. He taught her how to set snares that would yield a rabbit or a grouse, how to find the edible roots that grew by the creek, which berries were sweet and which were poison. Her hands, once soft, grew calloused and capable. She learned to move quietly through the woods, to listen to the whisper of the wind, to feel the rhythm of the wilderness. She was shedding the skin of the helpless widow and finding a strength she never knew she possessed. One evening, a pack of wolves, their hunger made bold by the lean end of winter, grew too close to the cabin. Their howls echoed through the valley, a chilling chorus that raised the hairs on Martha's arms. She stood by the door, rifle in hand, her knuckles white. Kestrel stood beside her, armed only with the knife and a hardened spear he had fashioned. "They smell our food," he said calmly. "They are testing us." He didn't seem afraid. He was a part of this wild world. He understood its rules. He stepped out onto the porch and raised his head, and from his throat came a sound that stunned her, a low, guttural cry that was not quite a wolf's howl, but something fiercer, something that spoke of dominance and territorial right. It was a challenge. The howling in the woods answered, then faltered, and finally faded into the distance. The wolves had understood. He came back inside his eyes, glowing in the firelight. He looked at her at the rifle still clutched in her hands. "Fear is a scent," he said. "They smelled yours. You must learn to make your spirit louder than your fear." She looked at this man, this fugitive murderer, according to the law, who had just faced down a wolf pack with nothing but the force of his will. She was not afraid of him. She was afraid of the world that had cast him out, the world that was now casting her out as well. The poison of the whispers from Redemption Gulch had worked in a way Thorne could never have intended. It had not driven her to betray Kestrel. It had severed her last ties to the town and bound her to him completely. Her cabin was no longer a refuge from her loneliness. It had become a fortress, and he was the only other soul inside its walls. As spring deepened, turning the mountainsides, a vibrant, living green, Bartholomew Thorne's patience began to wear thin. His veiled threats had not worked. The town's ostracism had not broken Martha Holloway's spirit. He was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and his desire for Martha's land with its year-round creek had curdled into a dangerous obsession. He needed leverage, something more than rumor. He needed proof that she was harboring the fugitive Kestrel. The $500 bounty was secondary. His true prize was the deed to her property, which he was certain he could seize if she were convicted as an accomplice. His search for proof led him to the dregs of Redemption Gulch, to the darkest corner of the saloon where the town's ghosts went to die. It was there he found Corporal Finn O'Malley. Once a proud cavalryman, O'Malley was now a broken man, haunted by the things he had seen and done. The army had discharged him for drunkenness and dereliction of duty, and he had drifted to Redemption Gulch, where a man's past could be washed away, or at least drowned in cheap whiskey. O'Malley had been a member of Lieutenant Gideon Price's patrol. He had been there on the day Price died. Thorne found him hunched over a sticky table, staring into an empty glass, his hands trembling with a perpetual tremor. He slid onto the bench opposite the drunkard, placing a full bottle of whiskey and a small, heavy leather pouch on the table. Finn O'Malley Thorne said, his voice a low purr. "I hear you served with the esteemed Lieutenant Price." O'Malley's bloodshot eyes flickered up first to the bottle, then to Thorne's face. Price was a snake, he slurred. Got what he deserved. Thorne's eyes narrowed. This was even better than he'd hoped. The official report says he was murdered by the scout Kestrel. That's what the wanted poster says. O'Malley gave a harsh, rattling laugh that turned into a hacking cough. Official reports, he spat, written by liars to protect other liars. I was there. I saw the whole thing. Thorne leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Tell me, Corporal. Tell me what you saw. There's more of this for you if your memory is clear." He pushed the pouch of coins across the table. O'Malley's hand shot out and covered the pouch, his fingers curling around it possessively. He uncorked the bottle and took a long, shuddering drink. The whiskey seemed to momentarily burn away the fog in his brain. Price had a taste for the native girls. O'Malley began, his voice raspy. He'd been after this one for weeks. That day he'd been drinking. He grabbed her, tried to drag her toward the tents. Her brother, just a boy, came at him with a skinning knife. Price laughed and shot him in the chest. Just shot him. The scout Kestrel, he was there. He tried to talk Price down, but Price turned the gun on him. They fought for it. The gun went off. Price, he just fell. O'Malley shuddered, the memory playing out behind his eyes. The other sergeant, he was Price's crony. He started yelling that Kestrel had murdered him. We ran. It was easier to believe the lie. Thorne sat back, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. The truth was irrelevant. What mattered was that O'Malley was a witness. He had seen Kestrel at the scene. Whether it was murder or self-defense would be lost in the telling. All a jury would hear was that a drunken, disgraced soldier saw an Indian kill a white officer. "So you saw Kestrel kill him," Thorne said, deliberately twisting the words. "I saw a fight. It wasn't." O'Malley trailed off, looking at the pouch of coins in his hand and the full bottle of whiskey on the table. He was a man with nothing, and Thorne was offering him oblivion. His shoulders slumped in defeat. Yeah, he mumbled into his chest. "I saw it. Kestrel, he shot him down in cold blood." Thorne had his weapon. A few days later, Martha made a necessary trip to town. She tethered her horse and was just about to enter the general store when she heard a commotion from the saloon. A man was thrown through the bat-wing doors, landing in a heap in the mud. It was the drunkard O'Malley. The saloon keeper stood over him, yelling, "And stay out, you useless sot! Your credit is done here!" O'Malley tried to get up, then collapsed back into the muck, sobbing. Martha felt a surprising pang of pity for the wretched man. As she watched Bartholomew Thorne stepped out of the sheriff's office, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. He saw her, and his eyes glinted with triumph. He walked over to the pathetic form of O'Malley, took him by the collar, and hauled him to his feet. "This man is a witness." Mrs. Holloway Thorne announced his voice loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "A witness to the murder of Lieutenant Price. He's going to help me and the sheriff find the killer and claim that reward." He looked directly at her, his meaning clear. "And we'll also deal with anyone who might have been helping the fugitive hide." Martha felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. Thorne wasn't just looking for Kestrel anymore. He was building a case against her. This broken man O'Malley was the key. She fled her errands forgotten and rode back to the cabin as if the devil himself were on her heels. She found Kestrel by the creek, carefully examining a series of deep, clawed marks on a pine tree. "Thorne has a witness," she said, breathless, stumbling to a halt beside him. She told him everything she had seen and heard. Kestrel listened impassively, his focus still on the tree. "A bear. A large male. He marks his territory," he said, tracing the claw marks. Then he turned to her, his dark eyes serious. "This witness, O'Malley. He speaks the truth of what happened, I don't know. He's a drunkard Kestrel. Thorne has bought him with whiskey and coin. He will say whatever Thorne wants him to say." Kestrel stared into the distance for a long time. "There are two kinds of truth," he said. "The truth of what happened, and the truth a man can be made to speak. They are rarely the same. A lie can be a heavy stone. This O'Malley, he carries it. It has crushed him." He looked back at her. "Thorne will not wait long. He thinks he has his final piece. He will come soon." The sanctuary of the cabin suddenly felt like a trap. They were cornered. Thorne had a witness the law on his side and the town's prejudice as his army. A direct confrontation would be suicide for Kestrel and ruin for her. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Kestrel looked from the bear's territorial markings on the tree to the path leading back to their cabin. His expression was grim, but his eyes held a flicker of something new. Not fear, but a cold, hard resolve. "A cornered animal has two choices," he said. "Wait for the hunter's spear or turn and face the hunter. We have been waiting. That time is over." He started walking back toward the cabin, his stride purposeful. Thorne is not the only one who can hunt for the truth. The air in the high country grew thick with an unspoken tension. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that danced at the edge of the clearing seemed to hold a threat. Thorne was coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Kestrel spent his days restless, moving like a caged panther, his senses on high alert. He was no longer just a healer or a quiet companion. He was a warrior, preparing for a battle he knew was inevitable. He took Martha's rifle, handling the weapon with a familiar ease that told her he had used such firearms many times before. He checked the action, the sights, his movements precise and efficient. "Thorne will not come alone," he said, his voice grim. "He will bring the sheriff and a posse. They will call it law." Martha felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. "They'll kill you," she whispered. "They will try," he said, his eyes meeting hers. There was no bravado in his tone, only a statement of fact. "But it is not my own death, I fear. A man who dies for the truth does not die in shame. It is the lie that follows that poisons the ground. One afternoon, as Kestrel was scouting the ridges above the cabin, he froze. His gaze was fixed on the distant plains to the east, a place Martha could barely see. He stood motionless for a full minute, a statue carved from the mountainside. Then he came down, his movements urgent. "They are coming," he said. "Thorne?" she asked, grabbing her own rifle. "No," he said, a complex emotion playing across his face, a mixture of sorrow, duty, and relief. "My people." He pointed, and she followed his gaze. At first she saw nothing, then she saw it, a single rider, then another and another cresting a far-off hill. They were not a war party. They moved slowly, deliberately. They were a search party. "My father's health fails," Kestrel explained, his voice low. "His spirit prepares for its journey. The council is divided. Stone Fist wants to lead the warriors on the warpath. He says my scouting for the whites was a betrayal, that my talk of peace is weakness. He uses my absence to feed his ambition. If he becomes chief, he will lead our people into a war they cannot win. He will lead them to their graves. The weight on his shoulders was immense. He was a fugitive from one world and a potential savior for another. The riders were not looking for a criminal. They were looking for a leader." "You have to go." Martha said the words catching in her throat. The thought of him leaving, of being left alone to face Thorne, was a terrifying void opening at her feet. But she knew it was true. His duty was to his people. His dark eyes held hers, and in their depths she saw the conflict that tore at him. "I will not leave you to face the coyote alone. You must." She insisted, her own fear giving way to a fierce resolve. "Your people need you. It is a greater need than mine." The lead rider, a stern-faced warrior with 3 eagle feathers in his hair, reached the edge of the clearing. He saw Kestrel, and his hard face broke into a look of profound relief. He dismounted and spoke in their native tongue, the words flowing fast and urgent. Kestrel replied, his voice calm and authoritative. He was no longer just Kestrel, the man she had nursed back to health. He was the chief's son, a man of authority and respect among his people. The decision was made. He had to go back. His departure was swift, leaving little time for the farewell that loomed between them. He turned to her, as the warriors waited respectfully on their horses. "Thorne will come for you when he learns I am gone," he said, his hands gently taking her by the shoulders. "He will try to take this land. Do not let him." "How can I stop him?" she cried, the carefully constructed walls of her composure finally crumbling. He reached into a pouch at his waist and pulled out something small, pressing it into her hand. It was a single perfectly formed kestrel feather, bound at the base with a thin strip of red-dyed leather. "My father taught me that a person's spirit is their truest name," he said, his voice a low thrum against the mountain silence. "You are not a lonely widow. You are not the outcast they call you. You have the heart of a hawk, fierce and brave. You sheltered the hunted. You faced down the coyote. This is your name. Do not forget it." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were memorizing her face. Then, without another word, he swung onto the back of the horse one of his men had brought for him. He gave her one last look, a look that spoke of promises and shared secrets. And then he was gone, riding east, with his warriors leaving her alone in the sudden, deafening silence of the clearing. Martha stood there, clutching the feather until the riders were nothing more than specks on the horizon. The cabin, once her sanctuary, now felt empty and vulnerable. The strength he had seen in her felt like a phantom, a story he had told her that she couldn't possibly live up to. She didn't have to wait long. 2 days later, Bartholomew Thorne rode into her clearing. He was not alone. Sheriff Miller, a portly man with a perpetual scowl, was with him, as was his foreman, Hank, and 2 other hired thugs from the saloon. They had come as a posse. Martha Holloway Thorne said, his voice ringing with smug triumph. He had clearly heard the news of the Lakota riders. Your guest appears to have departed. Seems his own kind came looking for him. I don't know what you're talking about, Martha said, standing on her porch, her rifle held loosely in her hands. Oh, I think you do, Thorne sneered. We have a witness. Corporal O'Malley saw the whole thing. Kestrel is a murderer, and you've been harboring a fugitive. That's a serious crime. He dismounted, walking slowly toward her. Under the territorial statutes, the property of a felon or an accomplice to a felon can be seized. This land is forfeit. Now you can leave peacefully, or we can have the sheriff here arrest you and take you to a federal judge. Your choice. This was his endgame. He had orchestrated it all. The whispers, the witness, the posse. It was all a sham to steal her land. She looked at the faces of the men. The sheriff looked uncomfortable but resigned. The others looked hungry like wolves closing in. She remembered Kestrel's words. Make your spirit louder than your fear. She raised the rifle, the click of the hammer being cocked, echoing in the clearing. This land was my husband's, she said, her voice clear and strong, devoid of the tremor she felt in her soul. It is my home. You are not welcome here. Get off my property. Thorne stopped, surprised by her defiance. He chuckled a low, ugly sound. A brave little hawk, he mocked. But you are alone, and we are many. He gestured to his men, who began to spread out, flanking her. The trap was closing. She was alone, just as he said. A single woman against a greedy rancher and his twisted version of the law. The feather in her pocket felt impossibly light, and Kestrel felt 1,000 miles away. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the clearing. The fight she knew was about to begin. The clearing was a stage set for a final, brutal act. As the sun set, painting the pines in hues of blood and fire, Martha stood on her porch rifle steady. Thorne and his men advanced, their faces masks of predatory intent. Last chance, Holloway, Thorne barked. Drop the rifle. The first man who sets foot on this porch will be dropped first. She countered, her voice ringing with newfound strength. The standoff was broken by a sound, the cry of a kestrel, answered by a chorus of calls from the surrounding woods. Lakota warriors, silent as ghosts, emerged from the trees surrounding the posse. At their head, riding into the clearing, was Kestrel transformed. He wore the magnificent eagle-feather headdress of a chief, his presence radiating authority. This land is under my protection, Kestrel announced, his voice booming. You, Thorne, are a thief and a liar. Thorne, pale but defiant, gestured wildly. You're a wanted murderer. I have a witness, O'Malley. You mean this man? Kestrel asked. 2 warriors brought forth a trembling, sober Finn O'Malley. Tell them the truth, O'Malley. The truth you were paid to forget. Before the entire assembly, O'Malley confessed. It wasn't murder, he stammered. Lieutenant Price was a monster. Kestrel stopped him. Thorne paid me to lie. Enraged at his ruin, Thorne drew his pistol to fire at Kestrel, but an arrow flew from the woods, burying itself in his hand. His men were swiftly disarmed. Later, before a great council fire, Chief Kestrel stood with Martha. He addressed his people and the watching townsfolk, declaring her land under his nation's protection as payment for the debt of honor she was owed. Then he turned to her, his voice softening. Before this sacred fire, he proclaimed, I claim you, Martha Holloway. Not as a possession, but as the other half of my heart. I ask you to stand by my side, to be my wife. It was a bold, tradition-shattering act. Martha looked at the great chief, who was also the man she had saved, and saw her future. In the warm glow of the fire, surrounded by two worlds now bound by this act, she gave her answer. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I will." The story of Chief Kestrel and Martha Holloway became a legend in the Big Horn Mountains, a tale whispered around campfires and passed down through generations. Theirs was not just a story of love, but of a courage that dared to bridge two worlds locked in conflict. They proved that honor is not defined by the color of one's skin, that strength is found in compassion, and that a home is built not with logs and nails, but with mutual respect and a willingness to defy a world that demands you hate. They carved out a small piece of peace in a time of war, a testament to the idea that even in the harshest wilderness, the most unlikely alliances can forge the most enduring legacies. If their incredible story of bravery and defiance moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button and sharing this video with someone who loves a true tale of the Wild West. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next story from the forgotten pages of history. What would you have done in Martha's place? Let me know in the comments below.